Hello friends, welcome back to LitBirdie, where we learn literature simply, especially for IGNOU MA English students. So today we'll be exploring block 6 of MEG-06, that is American Poetry Part 2, and we'll trace how American poetry evolved from the revolutionary period to modernism and feminism. And the important poets are we will trace the development of poetry from Whitman and Dickinson to Robert Frost, Wallace Stevens, Pound, Williams, and Adrienne Rich. These are the poets that we are going to study today. So let's recap a little bit. In the last video, I explained you about Walt Whitman, who wrote The Leaves of the Grass, and the other one was the poetess Emily Dickinson. So just go a little more in the past and explore how poetry evolved from revolution to self-expression. So American poetry, like its nation, was born out of revolutionary. We all know that in America the revolutionary era spans from 1775 to 1783. So this era was dominated by political prose and patriotic verse, because in this era the revolutionary war happened. So the poetry was the poetry of independence and identity. So in this era, writers such as Philippe Freneau, often called the poet of the American Revolution, used verse to express a new nation's spirit, and the themes were freedom, courage, and democracy. So Philippe Freneau's poems combined Enlightenment ideals with romantic feeling, bridging rational thoughts and emotion. As America grew politically independent after the War of Independence, America became politically independent. After that its poets sought literary independence as well, to break away from the imitation of British styles and British poetic tradition, and they created themselves something which was truly American. And this happened, and this gave rise to the formation of American identity. Now after this came the period of national consolidation and the birth of an American voice. After the revolution, the 19th century brought a period of national consolidation and the building of a distinct American identity. This was the age of Romanticism, where poetry became more personal, emotional, and visionary. Two poets shaped this transformation more than anyone else, and these two poets we studied in last block. These two poets were Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Now Whitman, with his Leaves of Grass, broke every poetic convention. We'd already discussed that he followed no rhyme, no meter, no restriction. He believed that poetry should sound like life itself. It should be free, it should be passionate, and it should be democratic. So Whitman's voice celebrated the human body, the soul, and the American landscape. In his poem Song of Myself, he declares, "I celebrate myself and sing myself." Whitman's poetry was the heartbeat of a new confident nation. It was optimistic, it was inclusive, and it was full of vitality. So this was all about Whitman. Now in the last block we also discussed about Emily Dickinson. So I am going through a little recap in this video. Emily Dickinson was a private poet of the soul. In contrast of Whitman, Emily Dickinson turned inward. While Whitman shouted to the world, Dickinson whispered to her heart. She lived a reclusive life in Massachusetts and wrote nearly 2,000 short poems, all that were discovered only after her death. Her poetry, with its compressed form, dashes, and irregular rhythms, revealed the unseen, which was pain, death, love, and faith. She wrote lines like, "Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me." This we already discussed in the last block. So Dickinson's introspection balanced Whitman's expansiveness. Together they laid the foundation for American poetic individuality, the belief that poetry could be both public and private, grand and minute. After that the Civil War happened. So the poetry during this era was greatly influenced by the environmental factors. The Civil War spans from 1861 to 1865. It was the time of deep national trauma that changed the entire tone of American poetry. Poets began questioning not just society but human nature itself. Themes of loss, disillusionment, and identity replaced the earlier optimism. Whitman, as a nurse in the war, witnessed suffering firsthand. His later poems became elegiac. Elegiac poems are sad poems. He wrote an elegy for Abraham Lincoln as well. Meditative and spiritual. His poems became meditative, spiritual, as well as sad. America had survived, but its innocence was gone. Then this post-war realism became the seat for modernism, a literary movement that dominated the early 20th century. So from pre-modernism to modernism, by the late of 19th century, industrialization, urbanization and World War I had created a world of chaos, doubt and alienation. Poets no longer trusted grand narratives or romantic ideals. All emotion, passion was gone from the poetry. Rather, poets turned to symbolism, imagination, and psychological depth. This was the age of Robert Frost, Wallace Stevens, Ezra Pound, and William Carlos Williams. And each of these poets redefined poetry in a very unique way. So in this block, this was the entire recap from the transition of poetry, American poetry from revolutionary era to the modernism period. Now in this block we will discuss the modernist poets like Frost, etc. So let's begin with Frost. This was the modern overview of American poetry. If you want, you can go through this slide, and major themes and literary movements are also given in the right hand side. Now when we talk about Frost, Frost was a modern traditionalist. Frost is often called the most American of American poets. He used the language of rural life. He talked about fences, roads, walls, woods, etc. to express profound truths about choice, responsibility and human loneliness. His poem In the Road Not Taken, he writes, "Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and I took the one less travelled by." Though Frost's form was very traditional, his vision was modern. He explored uncertainty, the tension between nature's calm and human struggle. His poems often look simple but reveal deep psychological and philosophical layers. He once said, "Poetry begins in delight and ends in wisdom," and that's exactly what his verse does. It begins with an image and ends with a truth. So this was all about Frost. From IGNOU point of view, you can study symbolism and everyday language. Frost use of symbolism and everyday language to express universal dilemmas and timeless truth. So this is important from IGNOU point of view. Now we moving on to the next poet. The next poet of modernist era was Wallace Stevens, who was a philosopher of imagination. Now, if Frost was the poet of the earth, Wallace Stevens was the poet of the mind. Wallace Stevens was a lawyer by profession, and Stevens believed that imagination creates reality. To him, poetry wasn't just beauty, it was philosophy. His famous poem was The Emperor of Ice Cream, and it's quite important from IGNOU point of view. So, in this poem, he captures the philosophy and imagination perfectly. This poem tells us that life is fleeting, death is real, and all we truly have is the present. So past and future, nothing matters. What matters is the present tense, present form. The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. This is the quote from his famous poem, The Emperor of Ice Cream. This poem's title itself is very ironic. It contrasts life's pleasure with death's silence. Through vivid imagery and symbolic language, Stevens reminds us that life's richness lies in its impermanence. Now, in the IGNOU exam, if you remember, try to remember Stevens' use of irony, imagination, and abstraction to explore the conflict between reality and perception. So, this was an important poet, and his poem The Emperor of Ice Cream is also important from IGNOU point of view. So it's better if you get to study the central idea as well as the critical perspective of this poem. In case you are having any issue, just comment me in the section below, and I will try to make a separate video explaining the critical perspective of the poem, of the important poems of this block. Now moving on to the next poet, it's William Carlos Williams. He was the poet of everyday America. Williams brought poetry back to the ordinary. He believed in simplicity, in finding beauty in daily life. His motto was no ideas but in things. In his poem, The Red Wheelbarrow, a simple farm image becomes a symbol of how meaning depends on observation. Williams rejected heavy symbolism and kept poetry rooted in real physical experience. He represents American modernism's simplicity, clarity, and sincerity. So this was all about William Carlos Williams. Now moving on to the next poet is Ezra Pound. He is an important poem and he is known to be the visionary of modernism. Pound revolutionized poetry through Imagism, short, sharp, image-driven verse that captured a moment in time. He believed in the power of precision and compression. His poem, In a Station of the Metro, contains just 14 words. Imagine just a 14-word poem. Yet this poem paints an unforgettable image. The quote from the poem is, "The apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough." This is the quote from the poem. He influenced nearly every modernist poet, including T.S. Eliot from the British poetry. Pound's cry of "Make it new," his motto was "Make it new," became the rallying call for 20th century literature. So this was all about Ezra Pound. And then the next poet, moving on to the next poet, Adrienne Rich. She is a female poet and she considered to be the feminist voice of American poetry. By the mid 20th century, America had changed again, socially, politically, and emotionally, and a new kind of poetry emerged, the feminist and confessional voice. Adrienne Rich became its leading figure. Her poem Snapshots of a Daughter-in-Law. This poem is very important from IGNOU point of view, and it has questions has been asked from this poem time and time again. So I would suggest that you go through this poem very deeply, try to understand the central idea and critical perspective of this poem. Also go through the summary of this poem in the IGNOU course material. So this poem exposes the frustration and limitations faced by women in patriarchal society. Through fragmented structure and vivid imagery, Rich portrays the generational struggle between tradition and independence. This poem is not just about one woman, it's about women reclaiming their voice and identity. Her lines question the silence imposed by culture and gender. If we can quote, I would like to quote something from this poem. "A thinking woman sleeps with monsters. This haunting metaphor captures the cost of being aware in a world that punishes truth." Adrienne Rich represents postmodernism American poetry, which was political, personal, and unapologetically bold. So this was all about Adrienne Rich. Now if we explore the themes of American poetry, modernist and postmodernist American poetry, the themes that we can found in all the poems are from revolutionary optimism to romantic expression, from modernist doubt to feminist awakening. American poetry is a mirror of its nation's soul. So this was the themes across the eras. Whitman and Dickinson gave America its poetic identity. Frost and Stevens explored human complexity. Williams and Pound redefined poetic language. Adrienne Rich gave poetry a voice of resistance and renewal. So we see that each era reflected America's journey from discovering freedom to redefining truth. So this was all about American poetry part 2. Part 1 we already discussed, where we studied Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Now in this, the two important poets that you should study are Robert Frost and Adrienne Rich. So you studied these two poets thoroughly, and you can touch upon Ezra Pound as well, because his motto was very famous, "Make it new." So just try to understand a little bit about Ezra Pound as well. Now let's discuss some frequently asked questions. So these are the frequently asked questions. When you can note down these questions from the slide. Now I would like to tell you the strategy of writing the questions from block 6. So first of all, whenever any question is asked, you start with historical context. In historical context, you explain the era and the movement. Then after that, discuss the poet's style, his themes and his ideology. Then use short quotes, one per paragraph is ideal. And after that you come to conclusion and conclude with the poet's contribution to the American identity. So this was all about the strategy, that how you are going to write to the questions. The typical questions include discuss Frost as a modern poet with traditional form. Then explain imagination and reality in Stevens' poetry. Analyze snapshots of a daughter-in-law as a feminist text. Comment on Pound's Imagism and influence. Compare Frost and Stevens as modern voices. Then how does Williams redefine poetic simplicity? So these are the important questions from this blog. If you want, just let me know in the comment and I would try to give you notes on these so that you can easily prepare these questions for your exams. So from Whitman's vast democracy to Rich's personal rebellion, American poetry has journeyed through centuries of transformation. It moved from the nation's voice to the individual conscious, and that's what makes it timeless. Each poem a reflection of a changing America. So if you want to succeed in Meg-06 exam with good marks, these are the key takeaways. Just go through these textual content and let me know in case you need any more help in terms of notes and other things, and I can help you with notes as well as the exam blueprint so that you can have just quick revision just before the exams. So in next block we will be studying American short story. So we are having two writers in American short story. One is Ernest Hemingway, the other one is William Faulkner. So both these writers are very important, and the next block we will study a bit thoroughly because questions are asked every year. Questions are asked from Hemingway as well as from William Faulkner. So we'll discuss the short story, American short story, next block. Till then, goodbye and take care.